Look.
These people truly believe that she is Jesus Christ.
This is the moment of rebirth upon a new planet.
I was told to leave my first wife and go up to the hills. I did. That I would be going to have a baby with another woman, and I did.
It was eerie. This was where some of the worst crimes were committed.
These are some of the 28 children collected by cult leader Anne Hamilton Byrne.
Bleached hair, blonde, something like an Aryan race.
Anne dyed their hair blonde.
We were designed kids.
She is the most evil person that I've ever met.
Anne Hamilton Byrne has managed to escape justice all her life.
Any comment to make now about what happened to the children? You know what happened to those children.
Are you evil?
Well, what do you call evil?
I love children.
Today I want to talk about a cult. Another one. Again. This one really is, I mean, I'm almost speechless, almost. Not only is it awful and weird and horrible, but it's actually frustrating more than the other ones because this person got away with it, pretty much. And it's really, really unfair how it happened. And I think that their victims are still trying to get justice. It's officially and most recently known as the family, but it used to be known as the Santini Kitan Park Association, as well as the Great White Brotherhood, but it's most well known as the family. There are several theories about why the cult leader got away with it, so we'll discuss that later. And also, there's this crazy rumor that Julian Assange, do you know, like the WikiLeaks guy, was one of the kids in this cult. And so we're going to talk all about that later. But as usual, I want to do what I usually do on my channel, which is I want to give you guys the facts. Then we'll discuss the theories, and then you can decide for yourself. This video is sponsored by Scentbird. The notes that I gravitate towards, which is fresh, fruity. Summertime is all about that. So whenever they come out with new stuff, it's always in that fragrance family. I don't like peppery, spicy notes. Like they make me go like, you know, when a dog smells something and they're like, so basically it's a monthly subscription service. You get a designer fragrance or even niche. Niche is this new thing that I'm into now where they're even more expensive than designer, but you can sample a large vial for $17 a month. This is a sample I got from an online order and I literally tried it once and the sample's almost done. But with Scentbird, you get a way bigger vial where you have like 30 days worth of a sample. This month I got one that I've actually been really dying to try, which is Tiffany & Co. And look, it came in like a Tiffany blue, vert de mandarin, vert de mandarin, noble iris, patchouli, and musk. But it's like a ladylike citrus. I think it's the iris. It gives it a powdery, but not like grandmother powdery because the iris is powdery, but the citrus is fresh. And so together it's giving like bougie citrus, if that makes any sense. Just bite me. Confessions of a Rebel. Ooh, you know what? It's creamier. The vanilla is really coming through. Ooh, this is like edible. I think they call it a gourmand fragrance. It is usually $17 a month for one of these, but you can always add on up to 3 of these a month. But if you use my code, which is 55% off, link in the description, it's just a little over $7 for your first month for one of these. Scentbird is available in the US and Canada. Thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. So the whole thing started in the 60s when a yoga teacher called Anne claimed to be a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. She didn't come out the gate with that. She began by portraying herself as like a yoga guru. This was in Australia in the 60s and yoga was becoming very trendy. And so Anne was teaching yoga to wealthy women in the suburbs as well as men, but it was mostly women at first. Quote, Anne was apparently a wonderful teacher, and these women became her first devotees. She was clever and intuitive. She knew how to find the chinks in people's armor. Often these wives were in unhappy marriages. Their children had grown up, and they were looking for new meaning. Divorce was still not accepted, but she could encourage the women to leave their husbands to join her. She also attracted gay male followers, offering them refuge from Australia's laws against homosexuality at the time. Anne didn't start claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ until she met Dr. Rayner Johnson. Now, Dr. Johnson, he became convinced of Anne's powers when he believed she performed a healing miracle in front of his very eyes. This is from Dr. Johnson's diary. It says, on Saturday, May 4th, 1963, a few months after we had first met Anne, another heartbreaking test came to her. Her daughter Judy had a little car of her own and had taken it out along the Point Nepean Highway near Frankston. She lost control and her car overturned. It could easily have been a fatal accident. At the city hospital to which she was taken, x-rays revealed a double compound fracture of the base of the skull. The able brain surgeon who operated, whom I happen to know personally, reported to Anne that her daughter had also suffered deep lacerations. He hoped, however, that the sight of her left eye would not be lost. Her mother immediately organized spirit help and prayers. 2 days later, on the Monday, Judy was sitting up in bed. Her blood pressure and temperature were nearly normal. The surgeon and the sisters who were in charge of her were surprised and puzzled. No explanation was ever forthcoming. A week after the accident, and following a major operation with evidential x-rays, the hospital authorities, being short of beds, suggested Judy could be discharged. I remember the deep effect this undoubted miracle had upon me. I had been in close touch to be sure of the facts and knew no normal explanation accounted for them. I heard afterwards the surgeon had remarked to hospital staff, "This is very queer." My recollection is that later on, Anne told me she felt she had failed in this test because of her anxiety. I was coming to realize with increasing awareness that there was something special about Anne. Although Dr. Johnson was a doctor, he was a physicist, he was very, left-brained, fact-driven, he had a huge spiritual side to him as well. And Anne sort of tapped into that. And having witnessed this miracle that he felt like science couldn't explain, he believed in her. In addition to being into spirituality and Eastern religions, there was something else Dr. Johnson and Anne were into. LSD. Acid. And so they experimented on themselves for scientific reasons and basically dropped acid. And on one of their acid trips, Anne is like, she has this epiphany that she is Jesus Christ reincarnated and that Dr. Johnson is John the Baptist. Again, in his diary, he writes about this. He says, her face became to my human eyes supernaturally beautiful, and she spoke with authority and divine power, as one might imagine Christ would do if speaking in the first person to each person there. Looking around slowly, she said, "Do you know who I am? I and my Father are one. My peace I leave with you. You will be my gurus, all of you." After that whole thing, it became a regular thing where they would take shrooms or psilocybin and acid, and they would have these religious experiences. Dr. Johnson would kneel at Anne's feet, and he would basically, treat her like a deity. They would have sacred hours together. And basically, Anne told him that she had a vision that the world was going to end in 1983. It's a secret, nobody can know, right? But the world is ending in 1983 and we have to do something about it. And this is when the mantra was born that would become the mantra of this cult, which is unseen, unheard, and unknown. They operated under a total veil of secrecy. So Dr. Johnson was the only one who witnessed this, and Dr. Johnson was married. And something would happen that would cause his wife to become a believer as well. Dr. Johnson, his wife, and Anne, and a few other people go to this ashram in India. When they're there, Anne says she has a premonition that Dr. Johnson's wife is going to get sick in India. Like that's never happened before. Especially if you're not from there and then you go there and maybe you drink the water or eat something. Is it the most rare thing? No. But she had a premonition that his wife was going to get sick. She does. She has like a severe illness and they like have to cut their trip short and come back. So because Anne predicted this and the wife got sick, the wife was a believer. Everyone else on the trip were believers. And it was like she had her first 7 members after this trip. They were her devotees, and they didn't call themselves the family at first. At first, they called themselves the Great White Brotherhood of Initiates and Masters. So now their mission was to get more followers. So what did they do? Well, Dr. Johnson had a lot of friends in high places, doctors, lawyers, politicians, businessmen, and what he would do is he would introduce Anne to his friends and as like a yoga teacher. So she would go there and teach them yoga, but she would also charm them. Everyone said that she was very charismatic, very charming. They talked about her eyes a lot. She had these gray blue eyes that seemed magical, like they could almost entrance somebody. This person said, in ancient times, we hear about enchantresses who could enslave people with one glance. She had eyes that looked through your soul. So when Anne would meet people, she would be like looking at them, you know, with her eyes, and she would be like, I've been waiting for you. You're special. And then they would drop acid. Then Anne got some followers that would be crucial to how powerful she became. These followers were psychiatrists at a hospital called New Haven. Not only were the 2 psychiatrists at New Haven her followers, but the owner of New Haven, it was a privately owned hospital, the owner was one of her followers too. So she had a lot of influence in this hospital. And this hospital would become the place where horrible things would happen. First of all, they would experiment on people. They would give them LSD and shock therapy, even lobotomies. And also, this is how she was able to get her children. She would essentially steal children from this hospital. Anne exercised total control over her followers. She began breaking couples up, like reassigning them to other couples, telling them, you need to get together and have a baby so that she could take that baby.
I was told to leave my first wife and go up to the hills. I did. I was told that I would be going to have a baby with another woman, and I did.
She even dictated how all the women looked because Anne was obsessed with looking young. She got a lot of plastic surgery at that time. She would get these facelifts, and it was really odd because she got so many facelifts that her hairline like kept getting farther and farther back because I guess they would have to cut her hairline to pull her face up. And so then she would wear wigs to have a new hairline, and then she would make the other women who were her followers do the same thing, like get the plastic surgery and then wear the same wigs that she wore. So now it's 1964. It's been a year since all this stuff went down, and Anne gets Dr. Johnson and his wife to buy property for the Great White Brotherhood. And this would be how she would get a lot of her money. She would end up being like a multimillionaire with properties all over the world because all these rich, powerful people, they would buy properties and put it in the name of her organization or put it in her name. So this property was in a very rural, isolated area in Australia, and it was called Santiniketan Lodge. Another way she made her money was that she would take 10% of all of her followers' income. And some of the followers would give her more than 10%. They would give her like a majority of their income. And so she had all these followers. At one point, she had like 500 wealthy followers. She would get 10% from each one. Then they would also buy properties. So she was slowly but surely amassing a fortune. She had properties in Australia, properties in the UK, properties in the States. When Anne first became a yoga teacher, she was actually a widow. Then once she became this guru goddess, she remarried, and It only lasted a year. She divorced him after a year. Then she got with another guy. His name was Bill Barnes, and she didn't marry him at first, but she did take his last name. So then she became known as Anne Hamilton Barnes, and her and Bill projected themselves as a married couple, and that's when they began adopting and stealing children. It's around this time that she changes the name of her cult from the Great White Brotherhood to the Family. She then registers the Family as a school. She then makes a deal with the education department to like foster and adopt children. So it becomes the school, the family becomes a funnel for her to adopt these kids. Some children are adopted, some children are her members' children that she takes as her own. Her members, when they would have kids, they would like offer them to her like a sacrifice of some sort. But that's not enough. She like wanted so many children. So what she then starts doing is, remember that hospital New Haven where they were doing all these experiments on people? Well, older social workers would convince these young girls quite forcibly to give up their babies. The mothers would go into the birthing room. They would be given massive doses of drugs. A pillow in some cases would be put over their faces so they never saw their babies, and their babies were handed over. The first children arrived in the early 1970s. Adoption was poorly regulated in Australia, and unmarried motherhood still carried social stigma. Through her network of followers, Hamilton Barn found it easy to procure infants. You had babies born in cult hospitals, delivered by cult midwives, handed over to cult social workers, says Lex Demand, one of only 2 senior detectives in the Victoria Police Force to try to bring charges against Hamilton Barn. Cult lawyers would falsify the adoption paperwork, and the identities were changed using false birth certificates. All the children were given the last name Hamilton Barn, and it was made to look like they were actually Anne and Bill's biological children. And she had her blonde wigs, and so she bleached the children's hair blonde, and she had this idea that she was creating a master race.
She wanted us to be the new race of children.
I had to start it. That was the divine vision.
Of children that were going to repopulate the world once it ended in 1983. And she would vet the children for, quote, racial purity and soundness of stock. Okay, and it says here that some of the parents willingly gave their children over to Anne because they felt like it was an honor that their children were considered part of the master race. It says all the children were blonde. They all looked the same. They had a strictly vegetarian diet, lots of yoga and exercises. They were trying to bring them up as perfect and to be the people who would take over when the world collapsed, which they thought was imminent. Cult formula: you're special. The world is ending. Give me your money. It's a secret. Let's do freaky stuff. A lot of these kids had no idea they were stolen. They were raised to believe that they were the biological children of Anne and Bill. Anne would cut the children off from the outside world. They had no concept of the world outside of these rural compounds and properties that she had, and this crazy routines and rituals that she would make them do. There is a property called Kai Lama, but it was known as Up Top. This is where the children were kept, okay? So when I say Up Top, I'm talking about this property. This is a major part of this case. Up Top was literally a house of horrors. Like literally. So let's talk about what happened at Up Top. So the kids were hidden there, and anytime there were like tourists or just people passing by, they would hide the children literally in a hole in the wall.
28 of you in there.
Up to 28, yeah.
That is disgusting. That is abhorrent.
The kids were homeschooled by the other cult members, and they were called aunties and uncles. And the aunties did most of the punishing and teaching, as well as the uncles too. The teachings were really weird because it was a mixture of Christianity, Eastern religions and yoga and all that, and then aliens, okay? And so they believed that in 1983, aliens were going to invade the earth and cleanse it of its evil. They also believed that in order to get closer to God, children had to suffer. And that you shouldn't intervene when children are suffering because this is God's will. And you know how Anne could perform miracles? Like the miracles that Anne would perform always happened during yoga and when they were dropping acid. There were just beatings, but honestly, beatings is not a good enough, or not good, but not a valid enough word to describe what was happening. It was torture, what they did to these children. And although Anne sometimes did it herself, and her favorite thing to do was use her stiletto heels to hit the kids in the head, okay? She would do that, but then a lot of times she would delegate the torture, it's not air quotes, it's actual torture, to the aunties. And sometimes when Anne was out of town, she would call the aunties and ask the aunties to hit the kids, do things to the kids, and she would want to listen to the kids screaming. Like she would be out of the country calling, like as if she was like yearning for children screaming. Like it's the most sadistic, disgusting shit ever. And God, so it wasn't just beatings though, okay? She would starve the children. Sometimes the kids would go a week without food. They were completely malnourished. And then when they did eat, it was a vegetarian diet that wasn't even like high protein vegetarian. It was like fruits and steamed vegetables. And so they were all underdeveloped and malnourished, and it's just horrible. And then even with all this lack of food and nutrition, they would weigh the kids. They would have these weigh-ins. And if a child was determined to be gaining weight or growing, because they're supposed to grow, but if they were gaining weight, they would be punished and their food rations would be cut. So let me read you a quote from an ex-child cult member. Her name is Sarah, and her story is so tragic. Sarah is no longer with us. She says, "Weighing was a very serious business, particularly serious for us because if it was considered that we were putting on too much weight, we would have our food rations cut down, and that was a dreadful proposition, food being the most important thing in our lives. We girls viewed the scales with hatred. They made our miserable lives even worse. Some of the girls would even try to induce vomiting on weighing mornings in an attempt to seem lighter." You know when children are starving and so their stomach like extends and they look like they have like a belly? So the kids had these kind of bellies and they would go around stealing food. They would eat bird feed, grass, just anything they could chew on. But it turns out that Anne had a complex about being a chubby kid. Because she was a chubby kid, they used to call her Putty. So I guess she was like projecting her stuff onto these kids. She did that a lot, and we're gonna get into her childhood because, as you can imagine, she had a crazy childhood. But we're gonna talk about what she did to these kids first. They were getting punished for pretty much anything, but in particular, bedwetting. The beatings were so severe when children wet the bed, and as you can imagine, a lot of children wet the bed living in these conditions. There was one kid that they nicknamed Zebra Stripes because he wet the bed every night, and so he got beat every night and his bruises never healed, and that's why they called him Zebra Stripes. One boy got beat so bad he got brain damage, and then they did water torture. Okay, it's like kind of like waterboarding, but basically there was a bucket. And whenever Anne said that someone was lying or needed a punishment of some sort, the aunties would take the kids and basically drown them in this bucket of water. Adding to this horrible treatment was the lack of medical care and hygiene. I mean, the kids always got infections. They got dysentery. So, I mean, it was just unbearable. Unbearable. The kids described it as hell on earth. And then imagine that they had to go through this grueling daily routine that was set up by Anne. Okay, this is what the kids had to do every day. They wake up at 6 a.m. First thing they do is they make their beds. Then they did an hour of yoga. Then they had 15 minutes listening to Anne and her stupid sermons.
To thy last supper, Let me alone to stay, O Son of God, for neither have I betrayed any secrets to thine enemies, nor have I given thee the kiss of Judas. I'm looking right at each one of you. You are the cosmic being. You're staring into the awakening. You are the initiate. You are the cosmic being.
Then they had to do 15 minutes of chanting, mantras, then 15 minutes of meditation, then 15 minutes to set up the schoolroom. Then they had breakfast, which was only fruit. After all of that, they could only have fruit. Then they would do 3 hours of schoolwork. Okay, I don't know what type of teaching they were being taught about the aliens coming in the 80s. I don't know. Then another hour of meditation, or she allowed them to play this game called Spaceball, which was deliberately designed to be a boring, tedious sport. It was either they meditate or they play Spaceball. Then it was lunchtime, and they would get a little bit of steamed vegetables and a little bit of fruit. Then hours of more lessons and more cleaning. Then from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., they had to meditate. And then they ate a, quote, bland vegetarian meal, read spiritual texts, and did their homework before going to bed. As the children were living in the squalor and torture, Anne was living in the lap of luxury. She had this hall where she would give her sermons. She would always wear these blue gowns and sit in a purple throne. She had on her wig, her pearls, her Chanel clothing, and her Chanel perfume. And she always drove fancy cars, Jaguars, and all this. Meanwhile, the kids are starving and they don't even have basic hygiene. Anne was extremely modest. She would never show any skin, and then she would project this modesty in an accusatory way on the girls. She would accuse the girls of having inappropriate sexual thoughts and desires. And then she would make the girls feel dirty for totally normal things like getting their period and developing like their breasts or their hips or whatever. She would make them feel dirty about it. Adding insult to injury, as shitty as Anne treated the kids, she treated her animals so well. She had a lot of cats and dogs, and she treated them way better than the kids. At one point, one dog died, and Sarah describes, remember Sarah, one of the kids, she describes the whole ritual they had to do when the dog died. The dog is called Joshua, by the way. She says, he was taken to Anne's room, and for 3 days we had to sit around him in a vigil, praying beside the dead dog, with incense burning and Handel's Largo playing in the background. It was the middle of summer, and after a few days, Joshua started to stink. At dawn on the 4th day, we buried him in the garden, a ritual that was supposed to allow his soul to move on to the next level more easily. This ritual was observed with all the animals that died up top. Then came the drugging. Okay, so when the kids were young, like from very young age, they were drugged with like heavy duty pharmaceuticals. Remember, there was a physicist, more than one physicist that Anne had who were her followers. And so they had drugs like Valium, Mogadon, flufenazine, diazepam, haloperidol, chlorpromazine, nitrazepam, oxazepam, and there's even more. Okay, and she was drugging and sedating these kids when they were very young. But then, when they turned 14, there was an initiation ritual called going through. And the drugging that happened during the going through was next level. The whole point of going through was to have a revelation and see Anne as God, as Jesus Christ. And the way that she would do this was, for 1 week, the kid would be in a dark room getting dosed mega doses of potent LSD. Once the kids were totally broken down and drugged out of their mind, okay, Anne would basically fake an apparition. Okay, she would come in the dark room. She would have someone blasting a bright light behind her and a bucket of dry ice. So there was like smoke coming off of the dry ice. So it would look like she was God floating. And some of these kids would actually believe that, oh my God, they had a vision, that they saw Anne and she really was God. And this was done when they were all 14 years old, the age where they would start to rebel, to instill this unshakable faith. So manipulative. Sarah described her experience going through the preparation for this initiation, reading yoga and the Bible, days of sleep deprivation, eating toast for breakfast and being bathed by Anne, and being put to bed and dosed with LSD and another unknown pill. After approximately 24 hours, Anne would give them more LSD. Anne then came in once or twice and sent messengers to say that I should prepare for a spiritual experience, that I should repent of my selfishness and my sluttish desire to be R-worded. Eventually, Anne came in once more and made me curl into a ball so that I could regress to babyhood. She gave me some more LSD and told me to keep working and that I would get some good insights into myself before long. The drugs made it difficult to tell what was real and what was hallucination. I am not sure what happened after that. I remember the door opened and a doctor came. He sat on the bed. He said I was evil. Subconsciously, I was wanting to be R-worded. I didn't know what he meant by this. He told me he was going to give me an operation, quote, to mix up your insides so you will never be able to have children, end quote. And that I would never want to think about sex again because I would be sick if I did. He had a knife. I think he cut me. I remember screaming. I thought I felt the knife deep inside me. In the redness of the pain, I heard Anne's laughter. She was in the room watching, goading him on. I thought that I heard her yelling, "Perhaps that will teach you, you whore, you slut. We will give you what you want." I passed out. Yeah. So let's talk about Sarah, because Sarah was very smart. Sarah was very brave. Even though she would end up escaping at one point, she couldn't escape what happened to her. She tried to kill herself several times. One of those times she ended up with an infection and her leg was amputated, and so she was then in a wheelchair, and she died at the young age of 46. And from what I found, they say the reasons of her death are unknown. There's speculation whether it was due to illness or whether, she took her own life, but she suffered for so long. This poor girl. I hope now she is at peace and just beyond this shit. And the victims that are still alive, they want justice, okay? And hopefully they get it because they deserve it. They deserve it. Let me tell you about Anne's childhood, although it doesn't excuse any of this, but I'll tell you, okay? So, I'm like so disgusted. I don't even want to talk about her. I'm like mad. After reading that, I'm just like, I want to throw up. So, Anne was born December 30th, 1921. Her birth name was actually Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards. She was the oldest of 7 kids and she grew up in poverty. Her parents were never around. Her dad traveled a lot and her mom had severe mental illness. It is said that Anne was in and out of orphanages. Her mom had this mental break. She basically set herself on fire in the middle of the street and ended up being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was then put in an asylum. And so Anne basically, her dad wasn't around, her mom was in the asylum, and we don't really know much about her teenage years. We just know that when she was 21, she got married to her first husband, and then he died in a car accident, and then that's when she was a widow, and that's when she turned to yoga, an Eastern religion, and tried to make money by teaching yoga to these wealthy housewives in the suburbs, and blah, blah, blah. You know the rest of the story from there. She only had one biological child, Judy, the one that she supposedly performed a miracle and healed, but she had several miscarriages after Judy. And before her husband died, she was planning to adopt. So some people think her childhood with the orphanages mixed with maybe some mental illness that she most probably definitely has, and then the miscarriages, I don't know, something fired the fuses beep in her brain, and I don't know what happened. No excuse though. No excuse. Her sermons are becoming more and more apocalyptic, and it's doom and gloom. And it's like, remember, the world is ending in 1983. They're now in the 70s, like it's happening. And so things start escalating. Anne's teaching is starting to preach that the children need to suffer more. Quote, "Suffer the children to come unto me, said the Lord." Now it's the 80s. The world's about to end. And you know what happens in the 80s? They get exposed. What happened was, there was a 10-year-old girl. Her name was Kim Holm. Her mother was Patricia Holm, and she was one of Anne's followers. And so she ends up taking her daughter to like offer her to Anne, and the father finds out. The father, his name is Hans Helm. He goes to police. He's like, my wife joined a cult. She kidnapped my daughter, and then, like, my daughter's missing. We need to go find her. So now the police get involved, and people are looking for this little girl. But remember, Anne has powerful followers, lawyers.
They definitely did have friends in high places.
Why did you start to take in the children?
I love children.
She has tons of money. At this point in the 80s, her net worth is estimated at 50 million Australian dollars, like including all the properties and everything that she has. So she's got all the money and all these powerful people. And so they take it to court. They try to argue. Thankfully, the judge does not believe the lawyers, and he issues an arrest, not for Anne, but for the mom. So although police end up capturing the little girl and arresting the mom, they don't actually blame the family as much. Like, they didn't find anything against the family. So they're still free to practice, but they're on the cops' radar. They're on the media's radar. I mean, there were reporters that were going up there like, are you hiding children here?
Keep a lot of children in the commune here, is that right?
No, that's not right at all.
There's no children here?
No.
And it all comes to a head when Sarah, okay, she starts to become rebellious. And Sarah ends up getting kicked out of the cult by Anne. And she goes to police. And she tells them everything. And they end up raiding up top that property. They raided in 1987. At that point, there were 14 children there. The police take all the kids. They question the aunties.
I was in the sector 1971 until September 1985.
I had been taught that police and other outsiders would hurt us.
This same year, Dr. Johnson dies, and Anne and Bill go on the run. They flee Australia. Remember, she has properties in the States and in the UK. They flee the country. There was one detective, the one I mentioned earlier. His name is Lex Demand. He was one of the few people who stayed on the case. There's a whole conspiracy about like why the other detectives weren't on it and all of that. But he stayed on the case. It was called Operation Forest. During this operation, they uncover the drug use aspect of it, because the drug force gets involved, kind of, let's say like the DEA of Australia or whatever gets involved, and they end up charging the members that were left behind, the aunties and uncles, with drug charges. And still though, they can't find Anne and Bill, the leaders. They're gone. The media was on them though, and there's one journalist, she was like the leader of this. Her name is, I want to give her credit, Marie Moore.
Can you explain to me why you treated the children like you did? Bill, if you'd like to give explanations as to your involvement and why the children were locked away.
I've got nothing to say to you.
She caught them. They, at one point, one of the guys attacks her.
Any comment to make now about what happened to the children? You know what happened to those children.
So after 1987, like in 1988 and 89, the other members get these drug charges and falsifying documents charges about the fake adoptions and all that kind of stuff. And Anne and Bill are still on the run. But then in 1993, they get caught by the FBI.
Case that unfolded in Australia came to its dramatic conclusion outside this house in the Catskill Mountains in Hurleyville, New York. The cult leader was there.
I knock with force.
What do you say?
I say, FBI, open the door.
But get this, they were not charged with child abuse or any of that. You know what they were charged with? It's conspiracy to defraud and to commit perjury by falsely registering the births of 3 unrelated children as her own triplets. But those charges were dropped. She pled guilty to the remaining charge of making a false declaration and was fined $5,000. Her net worth is $50 million and she gets fined $5,000. I bet you she has a pair of shoes worth more than that fine. So what the hell? Why wasn't she charged? So she gets away with it. She pays a fine, she gets away with it. So here's the official story as to why they didn't charge her with her actual crimes, even though they knew of them and they had all this evidence. Okay, I want to read you the quote. This is according to one of the children. Now he's grown up. His name is Ben. He said, Anne fought the extradition. She fought the court case with very expensive lawyers. The police knew that if they brought forward the crimes they did to us, we would get put in the witness box and we would be absolutely grilled that we made up this story. The powers to be that were around us said we couldn't handle this. We weren't asked. We weren't even given the option to go ahead with the trial. Looking back on it now, 30 years on, I don't agree. I wish they had asked me to stand in the trial, and I would have said yes. I think all of us would have. That's the official story. We'll talk about another theory about why people think, why she really got away with it. But for now, I want to talk about the aftermath and what happened to the kids, because even though they were rescued, the damage was done. A lot of them ended up killing themselves. Some of them attempted and survived. They had lasting damage to their brains, to their souls, to their minds. Is there justice? I don't know. But here's the deal. Anne had money and she still had a few loyal followers left. And over time, she got older and she got sick and she ended up being put into a nursing home. They said she had dementia. Then one of her followers came out and was like, no, it's not dementia. She's in another dimension. You guys just don't understand. He said, the people who think she is demented don't understand where she's coming from. They come in occasionally when their diary allows them and Anne doesn't want them there or doesn't want to speak to them, or she withdraws into an inner world where she doesn't communicate. They think it's dementia, but it's not. It's another dimension. I can't understand who some people want to turn her into something negative. Sarah was even there during an interview that Anne did where the reporter ripped her a new one.
They were not beaten.
Never.
Never. It's absolute bullshit. It's lies.
It didn't happen.
No.
That's
Yeah,
crucial.
what would
I don't
you do?
abuse my children. The children made all of this up, did they?
Could be. One day your children will betray you and then you'll know how hard it is.
This is Michael Stevenson, one of Anne Hamilton Byrne's most devoted followers.
As far as I'm concerned, you're living a lie. And
Because
you're
your
taking
entire
suffering
life
punishment
is a
for it.
network of
You're
lies.
suffering.
What I've suffered in this life is because of what happened up there.
I had a lot of pain.
As long as you blame others, you're nowhere. You're nowhere. You're living in a fantasy of pain and deprivation.
You were a monster at times.
I have nothing to say because I don't feel like one. You're not smart enough.
Well, I don't know what you mean by that.
No, of course you don't.
When Anne was in the nursing home, some of the children who are now adults, they went to visit her for like closure, for their healing, and they realized it was pointless because she took accountability for nothing, and they just realized it was pointless. But the thing is, right, there is money. She still had millions, and the few people left in the cult, the adults who were her caregivers, they wanted it. They were lingering around so that they could get some of that money. And some people say, and now there's actually like a case for like a settlement for the kids. They should get that money. Those millions that she made, they should get it, because a lot of them, they can't work. they're traumatized, they have disabilities, they should get that money. So that's what I'm hoping happens, like some kind of justice. It's not going to fix anything, but it's the least that should be done, considering all she had to do was pay $5,000 after what she did. When she was in the nursing home with dementia, some reporters went there, and I want to read you their description of how she was. Okay, they say, and so we sat with her in her tiny room in the nursing home. This once powerful, dangerous woman has been reduced to a skeletal shell, snapping in and out of sleep, talking in riddles, cuddling a plastic doll, and drinking through a straw, surrounded by photographs of the children she said were her own. She was dressed beautifully in blue and still had long silver hair. Her hairline, however, was on the top of her head because of the numerous facelifts she had during her reign to maintain the illusion of youth and immortality. Her speech was mostly incoherent, but she sat there nursing a plastic baby doll. She held the doll so tenderly, so gently. I found it incredibly powerful to witness. So Anne died in 2019. She was like 97 or 98. She didn't have a funeral and there was no headstone, and I hope they piss on her grave. So those are the facts. Now let's discuss the theories. The first one is, I noticed this coming up a lot during research where people were saying that Julian Assange was a part of this cult as a kid, and they're talking about his blonde hair and how he looks like these kids and stuff. It was really creepy. So this is what I found. He wasn't one of these kids, but he did have a connection to the cult through his stepfather, who was a part of this cult and wanted Julian to be one of the kids in the cult. It says, a few years ago, speculation emerged that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange had grown up in the family. His hair color didn't help, nor possibly his personality. Assange admitted that a man who was his mother's boyfriend in the late 70s had been a member of the cult. The man had been a, quote, sinister presence who sought to have a certain psychological power over his family, Assange said, and they eventually went on the run from him. But he said he never met Anne or had any direct contact with the group as a whole. Imagine if he was recruited into that cult. Maybe the WikiLeaks thing would have never happened. So the next thing I want to talk about is why there were not any charges. Like, is it true that the detectives were trying to spare the children? Or some people say that some of these detectives were part of her cult and kind of created this idea of like, we shouldn't harm the children, we shouldn't, to prevent her from actually facing justice. We know that there is one detective that really tried to help the kids and was such a big part in it, so I wouldn't want to taint him in any way. And I'm maybe he knows the truth and that this is really why they didn't want, you know, her to face justice, to spare the children, I guess. But it seems like the children wished that they did testify and they would have faced justice. But then again, hindsight is 2020. And then the last thing is the cult still operating today? And there is a clip about a guy who was investigating this for 48 hours.
We actually were shooting out there, and a fellow pulls up and he says, what are you guys doing here? And I said, we're doing a story about a cult. And he goes, it's not a cult. And he peels out and goes into the driveway of the house. So they're still active and they're still believing in their Messiah.
So it seems like they might still be operating today with the money that is still there. I think they're saying they still have 5 to 10 million left, which is why hopefully the survivors can get some of that money. So hopefully that happens for them. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.